The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Alan Blumkin on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm here with my partner, David Nemec, the namesake of David Nemec's Old-Time Trivia and History. Again, we have our usual guest, Ian Kahanowitz, and the subject today will be Session 3 of the Evolution of Baseball Rules. David Nemec, a number of years, wrote a book discussing all of this, and he is considered one of the biggest authorities on rules and available. So, welcome, gentlemen.
Welcome to both of you. Great to be with
you. Okay, David, you want to start from where we left off the last time?
Yeah, we left off somewhere between 1888 and 1889. In 1889, we did discuss the fact that the 3 strikes and 4 ball rule was set firmly.
Yeah.
But one thing we haven't discussed as of yet, we've been a little bit remiss in not discussing the changes in substitution rules. Baseball began with a rule in place that the only way a player could be replaced, he could leave the field of his own volition or for any reason under the sun, but unless he left because of an provable injury, he could not be replaced. In other words, if your first baseman was called home by his wife because she was delivering their first child suddenly, you were not at liberty to replace him. You had to play with 8 men. There was a game in 1872 where Cleveland arrived in Brooklyn with only 8 men and expected to get somebody out of the stands to fill in. And the Brooklyn Atlantics scotched that idea. They said, no, you can't really get one of those guys. They're too good. They're professional players too. So Cleveland was forced to play with 8 men for the entire game, and they actually won. Charlie Faber got the victory. The only pitcher ever to pitch a full game, and only 7 men behind him. And this continued throughout the early years. And teams usually played in the outfield, and most often right field, since it was less often hit to, because there weren't that many left-handed hitters initially. Would station their second string pitcher in right field. So if the game got out of control one way or the other, he would be called into pitch, and the pitcher would then move to right field. That was the way pitching changes were made in the early days. It wasn't always the right fielder, but most commonly was. And if a player were injured and came forth and said, look, I sprained my ankle and I slide into the third, or my finger looks like it's broken, and the opposing team's captain refused to agree with the injury, the team with the injured player was often stuck finishing the game with him. And in many cases, it was a deciding factor. If the guy really had a sprained ankle or a broken finger, it was tough. But most teams had to keep in mind the fact that they were going to run into the same situation too, and if they were notoriously known as a team that did not allow substitutions when injuries were spoken for, they too would suffer the consequences when one of their own players were injured. This changed finally in 1889. For the first time, each team at the beginning of a game on the scorecard, when they handed in their lineups, was allowed to designate a 10th man, and that 10th man would be allowed to enter the game at the end of an inning in place of any player. Most commonly, the 10th man listed in 1889 was a second string pitcher, so that they wouldn't have to play a pitcher in right field or wherever. And what was not put into place is what would happen when that player came into a game. Say your pitcher was getting racked at the end of the 5th inning, you decided to replace him. Well, there were no provisions as to would that pitcher get warm-up pitches? all it was said was he immediately had to take the field. And teams who were batting said, well, let's get started. Why is he throwing the ball around the infield? He doesn't get those kinds of warm-ups. There were no rules then. It hadn't really even been considered what would be done when a substitution like that entered the game. The substitution rule was liberalized again a bit in 1890 to include a second player, an 11th man, who could be a substitute at any point during the game. And then in 1891, the rules were changed so that for the first time, any player could be substituted for at any time for any reason. And this brought forth something that had never really been even a consideration in baseball until then, the pinch hitter. Previously, even in perfect games, the two perfect games in 1880, the bottom of the batting order, which was usually the pitcher, had to step to the plate in the ninth inning if he were the 27th batter, and it was just tough luck for the team at bat. They were down 1-0, as was the case, and often in no hitters in perfect games. They weren't allowed to pinch hit for the pitcher. Now you could, and there were players who began to make something of a living just being able to come off the bench and pinch hit. Probably the first really great pinch hitter to emerge from this was Duke Farrell. That wasn't until later during the 1890s. There weren't any players as such who were really strong pinch hitters in the early 1890s. But here you have really the game has been modernized. What's still left to be addressed is the pitching distance. And what has happened as the 1880s have ended and the 1890s are beginning, pitching has become much more formidable than hitting, with one exception, and that we can explore as we discuss rule changes in 1890. That was the year that the Players League formed, taking most of the best players from both the AA and the NL, putting them in one league, the Players League, with 8 teams, installing teams. 7 of the 8 teams were installed in existing major league cities. The only one that wasn't was a team that was entered at the last minute in Buffalo. And we can start by discussing the Players League, which had a number of changes that they initiated. The first change they initiated, it was the introduction of 2 umpires in every game. They had 2 designated men to umpire in each game. These men were hired. They were on the staff of umpires. So the staff really included about 16 men, or 8 men, since there were 4 games a day. The umpire staff changed during the season, but in every game, I don't know of any exceptions during the Players League season, they had 2 umpires. Previously, the AA had experimented with 2 umpires in 1888, but they hadn't formulated it into a rule. But in 1890, the Players League came forth with a rule that there would be 2 umpires in every game. They came forth with a second rule that the pitching distance would be lengthened to increase hitting. And this is not a commonly known fact. The pitching distance in the Players League was, I think, 57 feet 6 inches. Not the present 60 feet 6 inches, but also not the 50 feet that was still in existence throughout the National League, American Association, the minor leagues in 1890. And we should discuss how that distance really was set, because when the pitcher released the ball, it wasn't that the National League pitchers were only 50 feet from the plate, whereas Players League players were 57 feet from the plate. It wasn't that much difference, actually, at the point of release. But the pitcher had to start at a distance of 57 feet 6 inches in the Players League, and that did increase hitting tremendously. The Players League hitters really feasted in comparison to National League and AA hitters in 1890. And interestingly, not the National League so much as the American Association dominated the leaders board. This was a big surprise because everyone thought at that point, not everyone, but most of the authorities, believed that the National League was playing a superior brand of ball. They had won the World Series in 1887 with Detroit beating St. Louis. They'd won again in 1888 with New York, beating St. Louis. And then in 1889, Brooklyn emerged, ending the 4-year reign of the Browns as the AA champion, and they too fell to the National League New York Giants. So the National League was regarded as markedly superior, but it didn't reflect. That did not reflect itself in the AA, or not in the Players League final stats. The leaders board was dominated totally by AA players. Pete Browning of Louisville led the AA in batting. The leading pitchers were Mark Baldwin and Silver King, also had both spent the 1889 season in the AA. You run down home runs. Harry Stovey led. Harry Stovey was from the Philadelphia, the AA. The only player who led, NL player who led was Hardy Richardson, I believe, led an RBI. And Hardy Richardson had played for Boston in the NL. So hitting in the Players League disguised to a point the fact that pitching was becoming very, very dominant. And this is where I think we can begin. And Al and Ian, feel free at any point to chip in here with observations of your own.
I didn't know that about the Players League. I thought that when they went to 60 feet, 60 feet 6 inches in 1893, that was, it was strictly from 50 feet.
No, it wasn't. That's the Players League. The Players League really had a chance to make breakthroughs on a number of fronts. They introduced a 2-umpire system, which was definitely to the benefit of the game. They introduced the increased pitching distance. They had an opportunity, instead of going head-to-head with the National League, of playing ball on Sunday. They also had an opportunity to integrate. And Ward, John Montgomery Ward passed up these opportunities, which really could have exploded the game right there in 1890. Here you have a league, 2 umpires, increased pitching distance, allowing black players, Indian players, whatever, into the game, playing on Sundays, competing with the AA, which played on Sundays. Not every AA team could play on Sundays. And, of course, not every city would allow Sunday play. New York, for one, Philadelphia wouldn't allow Sunday play. Boston wouldn't allow Sunday play. So even if Sunday play had been allowed in the PL in 1890.
Yeah, Cleveland wasn't allowed because that's what caused the Spires to, go into the
Cleveland would get around it by playing in suburban areas, which really weren't suburban then, but more a little bit out in the country. But Chicago in the Players League could definitely have played on Sunday. They were free to play on Sunday. And Pittsburgh wasn't, Philadelphia wasn't, New York, Chicago weren't, Brooklyn wasn't.
Pennsylvania allowed it till I think 1934.
Yeah, they were the last holdouts against Sunday baseball. But so the Players League had opportunities to really, really change the game. And it would have been interesting if they had come on for a second season, and what would have happened to Major League Baseball. And instead, as we know, the Players League pulled it after 1 year, and the National League came out a major winner. They corralled several players from the American Association after the 1890 Players League folded. Players that were supposed to return to their original teams and circumvented it in several cases. Other cases, teams had neglected to reserve them, AA teams. And there was a huge fight, and the Pittsburgh team name was changed to what it is today, the Pirates, because they induced Lou Bierbauer, a second baseman from Philadelphia, to sign with their club. But meanwhile, other clubs, another player from Philadelphia, Harry Stovey, was stolen by Boston of the National League, and the National League really kind of feasted on the Players League collapse. And the 1891 season, which saw the introduction of two substitutions and also saw the reduction to two major leagues once again, 8 teams in the two existing leagues, was the last call of the beer and whiskey ball league, because it folded after the 1891 season. Teams couldn't keep up with their National League counterparts in attendance. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the financial support from outside forces. And the National League and American Association met over the winter of 1991 and formed a single 12-team league, which brought into the National League 4 teams from the American Association: Louisville, Washington, St. Louis, and Baltimore. And the league officially became known as the National League and American Association of Baseball Clubs. That was its name throughout the 1890s, but few called it that. It was known really pretty much by the media as the National League. And we can begin talking about rule refinements. I think we probably should begin in 1891. Do either of you have anything else on the 1891 season besides the substitution rule that we could talk about?
I got some from the Players League. Again, you mentioned that, again, they tried to distinguish themselves. Unfortunately, they didn't take full advantage. Although one thing is true, they did outmaneuver the National League by having bigger attendances. Unfortunately,
absolutely.
They outsold gate receipts to no avail. But the problem is that they didn't have basically the money that the National League had, and so by the end they were hurting for money. However, with the two umpires, the National League didn't adopt that until the 20th century. But each umpire had to be all in white. They had to be dressed white, of all the silly things. Also, all teams wore white uniforms at home, except for the Philadelphia club, who wore navy at home and gray on the road. Chicago and Cleveland wore black on the road, and Philadelphia, who wore dark maroon on the road. Now, the Player League was also the first league to institute the infield fly rule, defined in the play.
Very, very good point.
I didn't know that either. Wow.
Yeah, they had the infield fly rule. It wasn't worded quite in the same manner as when it was first introduced in the National League, but it was the embryonic infield fly rule. That's very, very good, Ian. Yeah, I neglected to mention that, and that's very important, because this had been fought for a number of years, because there were too many easy double plays where an infielder would trap an easy pop fly. The runner would be lax in running to first base. The batter wouldn't run it out, and the infielder would trap the ball. Either throw to second or tag the runner who was coming toward him, and then throw to first, and then have an easy double play. And the Players League dispensed with that too. And again, the National League and American Association, like the two umpire system, did not pick up on it. They did not pick up on the increased pitching distance, and they were back playing ball as much as they had in 1889 with a two league system, and except for the substitution rules, baseball much the same, with a marked decrease in hitting, which really fell through the floor in 1892. You had people like Jake Beckley, a Hall of Famer, was hitting in the 230s. Cap Anson, I think, hit like 272 that year. You had really, really fine hitters who were really
like
struggling.
1968. Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was almost like 1968. Yeah. Yeah. There were very few 300 hitters. Games were really low scoring. The crowds were very, very sparse, especially in the American Association, entries into the National League. Washington and Louisville, who both had poor teams, as did Baltimore, had miserable attendance. Baltimore team became very formidable later on, but their first year in the National League in 1892, there were not much competition for anyone. And Washington, was really poor too. And Louisville never got it together to be a threat in the 1890s. But the St. Louis team came in fairly strong into the 1890s. But there were a lot of defections to ensconced National League clubs from the St. Louis team. Tommy McCarthy jumped to the National League, ended up with Boston. They lost Comiskey eventually. They lost just about everybody, all their star players. Silver King did not go back to St. Louis after the Players League ended. All the stars from the Browns pretty much deserted. So they too became a drag in the National League. The four American Association teams.
St. Louis.
They were the bottom feeders.
Yeah, it was terrible in the late 1890s, and they became decent when the Robesons, who owned both of them, decided that St. Louis was a better venue than Cleveland was, and they transferred everybody there.
Yeah, that happened in
syndication baseball. And they weren't the only one. You had Pittsburgh, Louisville, you had Baltimore, Brooklyn. You had a few of those during that period where owners had interests in more than one team.
And we can start talking about that too when we get to the mid-90s. Even though there was no official comment on it, there was an introduction of the minor league system done by John T. Brush in Cincinnati. He formed a bond with the Indianapolis Western League team, and he was shipping back and forth players at will. And other teams began to pick up on it too. So it hasn't been really, nothing has ever really been done in depth about the researching or writing about the minor league system introduction in the 1890s. But the late David Ball was in the process of doing it. He had a real handle on what was going on and was a very good writer. And unfortunately, we lost him before he could really get the book off the ground. But he really had something that could have been quite a breakthrough book.
So let's get to 1893. And how did they decide on 60 feet 6 inches? Was that purely by accident, or somebody miscalculated something and instead of putting down 60 feet, they put down 60 feet 6 inches?
Well, it was really only the back line of the pitcher's box I think that it was really only about a 5 feet, really a 5 feet increase, because by the time where the pitcher released the ball. I'm a little fuzzy on why
Did they get rid of the pitcher's box at the same time as put the slab down?
They did. That's a very good point. They put a slab down. Pitcher had to have his back foot anchored to the slab when he released the ball. And that slab was 60 feet 6 inches from home plate. There was at one point a fallacious story going around that the 6 inches were a misprint, and it really should have been 60 feet, 0 inches, and the 0 was misread as a 6. But that's not true. It did begin as 60 feet 6 inches, and the slab was put in. The pitcher had to have his back foot anchored to it when he released the ball. The misfortune about that was the umpire, with no runners on base, the single umpire still in the National League, was stationed behind home plate.
Yeah.
He was left to judge if that pitcher had his back foot anchored to it or not. And many pitchers cheated. They dragged the foot forward as they, released the ball, or they actually did not step on the rubber. They stepped in front of the rubber.
In other words,
notorious cases of that. But it became 60 feet 6 inches, and the desired effect took place immediately. Hitting and scoring jumped, immensely in 1893.
1894 was a very big hit this year.
And the odd thing about the whole thing about the pitching distance change is the huge increase in hitting and scoring did not occur the first year. The pitching
the second year
lengthened. It occurred the second year. No one really has ever produced what to my mind is a satisfactory explanation for it. It just seemed to be one of those bizarre things. Whether it was that hitters, took it. I don't know whether hitters adjusted better or pitchers tried to do things in 1894 they hadn't in 1893. It was unclear. There's no good explanation for what happened.
And there were a number of pitchers that could not make a transition. I remember especially as Hutchinson on Chicago.
Yeah.
There were several pitchers that could not make the transition.
Yeah, Bill Hutchinson was the most famous case. But others too. Gus Wang was another one. Wang would be a cinch Hall of Famer, and he probably should be anyway. But his curveball at the distance, when it was moved back 5 feet, broke too early. His curveball, he had a late breaking curveball at 50 feet that was very, very tough. But when he had to move back and release that curveball, it broke before it reached the plate and often came to the plate. By the time it got to the plate, it was in the dirt. He wasn't getting batters to swing at it anymore. Wang still was a decent pitcher in the 1890s and lasted until the turn of the century. But he was never again. Wang was the guy the only pitcher ever to win 30 games in 3 consecutive seasons in 3 different leagues. And, it was incredible. And, he to my mind, is one of the most underrated players in the 19th century. Somehow he never gets on the ballot, the Hall of Fame ballot, which is 19th Century Committee sends out every year to recognize the most neglected 19th century player. But he's never made it thus far. But I think he's very deserving. But Al, you're right. There were a lot of pitchers who could not make the adjustment, and that went on throughout the 1890s. But it started to change by 96, 97. Changed even a little bit in 95, because what was happening was new pitchers were coming along, and they learned to pitch at the 60-foot 6-inch distance in the minor leagues. So they were arriving in the major leagues as polished pitchers at that distance. And if their record was good in the minors, chances are it was going to be pretty decent in the majors too. So by the end of the 1890s, you had guys like Vic Willis coming along, Joe McGinnity. They polished their game in the minor leagues at the 60-foot 6-inch distance. We should get back to the rules in the mid 1890s because they did change dramatically.
Okay.
The infield fly rule, which Ian has already cited, came into existence in 1894, and there was also a rule about the bunt foul strike, or the intentional intentionally hitting a ball foul, which became a strike in 1895. And this had a great impact on some hitters right away. It didn't all happen when the foul ball became a strike in every instance in 01. It really started to happen in 1895 when batters used to stand up at the plate, people like John McGraw and Hugh Duffy, and they'd choke up on the bat. And if they saw a pitch they liked, they'd move their hands down and take a full swing at it. If they didn't see a pitch they liked, but they knew it would be a strike, they'd just give it a little punch it foul. Just tap it foul. And as long as they didn't bring their hand up into the bunting position, that wasn't called a foul ball until 1895. And when that became a rule in 1895, if you look at Hugh Duffy, you'll see a man who just fell off the table. Right after he had 440, a record 440 in 1894. Never again, nearly the same player. Joe Kelly, never again, nearly the same player. These guys were really brutally affected by the rule change. McGraw, not so much, because McGraw had terrific bat control. But Kelly and Duffy were the leading examples. Other hitters were affected too. One who was not, a very curious case, was Ed Delahanty. Now, if you look back at Ed Delahanty's career, he came into the majors in 1888 as a second baseman and not much of a hitter. He continued to be mostly a middle infielder, second baseman and shortstop. Not much of a hitter until the 1890s. And suddenly, in 1892, 1893, Delahanty blossomed into one of the greatest right-handed hitters ever. And an explanation is still awaiting us for what changed him into such a great hitter, because he was playing for a team that was notorious for not having good hitters. It was still managed in the late 80s and early 90s by Harry Wright, who was one of the last managers to hold out for little ball. And Wright believed in moving runners along, bunting them along, just trying to go with the pitch, not use much power. And he actually had a very adverse effect on several players. Sam Thompson, a great slugger with Detroit in the 1880s, came to Philadelphia after Detroit folded in 1888. He was awarded to Philadelphia in 1889, and Sam Slugger was a shadow of what he had been in Detroit for several years until the pitching distance changed in 93. For those years in between 89 and 93, Thompson was not much of a hitter, not productive, was forced to play the type of game that Wright wanted, and suffered for it. And a lot of good hitters did. And Wright managed when Wright left the Phillies, and Art Irwin took over as manager. They really became a terrific hitting team. I mean, they had a 340 something average in 1894 as a team. They had 4 outfielders, 4 qualifiers for the batting title. Tuck Turner was a substitute, but he could play any position, so he played the outfield in days when Delahanty played first base. He took over for Billy Hamilton, who didn't play a full schedule usually. And Thompson also didn't play a full schedule, missed a lot of games in 94. So in 94, you had 4 outfielders from one team, all batting title qualifiers, and all hit over 400. And it was incredible. It was incredible. The Phillies were scoring 10 runs and losing. The Phillies would win 15-12, 17-11, 16-9, 14.
Just like 1930.
Yeah, it was like 1930. Only they were a better team in 94. They were better.
Yeah.
Very good. It's very, very good link to 1930. Yeah, exactly the same team doing the same thing. Only their pitching staff was with Wayne and Jack Taylor, and they had a couple of other pitchers who were pretty good. They were competitive in 94, but they were never contenders, even with all that hitting, because they just never could put the pitching together. And Wright had always had teams with good pitching, but when the pitching distance changed, Wright by that time was at the end of the line health-wise. The Phillies became known for their hitting instead of for their defense, pitching, and base running. It was a very, very abrupt transition and a very important one. But we should say something really about the infield fly rule and the refinements that were made to it. Would either of you like to talk about that?
Now let's save that for the next time.
Okay.
Okay? All right, because, I think we've hit a point where we can pick up next week and go more deeply into this stuff.
Good. Okay.
Okay. Ian, you have anything to add?
Yeah, large padded mitts were allowed for catchers in the early 1890s. We started getting away from fielding a ball with your bare hands and stuff, and the catchers were allowed to get some mitts going. Also, the pitching slab was enlarged to 24 inches by 6 inches in 1894. Bats were permitted to be 2 3/4 inches in diameter, and not to exceed.
The flat bat was done away. The flat-sided bat was done away with. But the mitts is a good one because mitts were getting bigger and bigger. And in 1894, they put a rule in limiting the size of mitts, and particularly catcher's mitts. And Leif Cross, who'd begun as a catcher, converted to a third baseman in the mid-1890s, and continued to use his catcher's mitt on third base. And everyone figured when the rule was put in, reducing the size of the mitt or glove that could be worn, that Cross was finished as a third baseman because he would have to use a regular glove. Didn't happen. Cross shaved his catcher's mitt to the proper size, and used his catcher's mitt, as far as I know, into the 20th century. I don't know of anything to controvert my feeling that he used it until he finished his career with the A's in around 1907, 1908. I think he played with a catcher's mitt for the entire career, and that's something that I think is of real interest. I don't know if he was the only one who did it. I do know that there were players still playing barehanded into the mid-1890s. Bid McPhee finally went to using a glove for the first time, but there were several other players, pitchers in particular, who remained barehanded throughout their careers. And there was a guy in the minor leagues playing first base as late as 1900 without a mitt, without a glove, with no protection at all. So we can talk about this next time because it gets fascinating.
All right. So, David, I want to thank you. Ian, I want to thank you. And we'll resume next week on these topics. Very, very fascinating stuff. I'm learning things.
Great. I enjoy these too.
Okay. So everybody have a good week, and hopefully we'll be out of the deep freeze in the Northeast by then. Take care.
Take care, folks. Bye-bye.
Okay, sign off.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good to be with you again.